The Journey of Neurons by Isa and Gracie. In order to understand how an action potential goes through a neuron, you must first understand the structure of a neuron. In order for neurons to become active, they must receive action potentials or other stimuli. Dendrites are the structures on the neuron that receive electrical messages. Once dendrites obtain information from other cells and carry that information to the cell body, we encounter the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a semi-permeable barrier around the cell body. The cell body is the control center of the neuron. It directs impulses from the dendrites to the axon. The nucleus is located inside the cell body. The nucleus is a control center of the soma or the cell body. It tells the soma what to do. The next structure, and one of the most important structures in the nerve cell, is the axon. The axon is an impulse-generating and conducting region. It carries the action potential throughout the nerve cell. The next structure along the axon is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer around the axon. This helps increase the speed at which impulses can go through the axon. The myelin layer is made up of Schwann cells. As you can see, the action potential is traveling down the axon. Another important structure to note are the gaps between the Schwann cells. These gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier. This is used through a process of saltatory conduction, a situation where the speed of an impulse is greatly increased by the message jumping the gaps in the axon. As we go down the neuron, we reach the axon terminal. The terminal are branch-like structures of the axon that are meant to form junctions with other cells. These junctions are supposed to pass on the action potential to another nerve. But how do they do this? The action potential is passed on through a structure called synapses. These can be thought of as neuron-to-neuron connections. When the action potential reaches the end of the axon, the electrical signal is converted into a chemical signal, and the axon releases chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are how the action potential can carry throughout other neurons. Neurotransmitters are carried by synaptic vesicles, which are in the synaptic cleft. These vesicles are then transported to the dendrites on a receiving cell. The neurotransmitters then reach the neuroreceptors on the other cell, and the message carries on. Now that we know the basic structures in a neuron, we must now know how the action potential can physically go through a neuron. So we already know that neurotransmitters reach the dendrites, and the dendrites send these signals to the soma to be processed. However, how does the soma process that action potential throughout the axon? Our journey begins in the beginning of the axon. Within the axon, we find this structure. This is a phospholipid bilayer. The head is hydrophilic, while the tail is hydrophobic. That's why the tail is faced away from the cell interior and exterior, while the hydrophilic head is towards the interior and exterior. It should be noted that the cell exterior is more positive than the cell interior. This is because there are more positive ions on the outside of the cell than there are on the inside of the cell. One structure along the phospholipid bilayer is the sodium and potassium pump, which pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions it brings into the cell. This is working through active transport, as it requires energy to force the ions against an equal balance. Another structure to note is the sodium channel, represented by the red or maroon channel in this diagram. This brings sodium ions into the cell during depolarization. The other channel, represented by the green channel, is a potassium channel, which allows for potassium to go outside of the cell. The action potential begins through a reversal of charge. This happens through depolarization. Depolarization occurs when the potassium channel is closed and the sodium channel is open to allow sodium to come in, but the potassium can't get out. This makes the inside of the cell more positive, since more positive ions are in the cell. To get out of this unnatural state, once the action potential has passed along to another part of the axon further down, the cell must go through repolarization. Repolarization is when the sodium channels are closed, so no sodium can come in, but the potassium channels are open, so the potassium can flow out of the cell. This makes the exterior positive and the interior negative. However, the charges are still imbalanced, so now we must return to resting potential, which was the original state of the cell where all the channels are open. This means sodium can come in through the sodium channel, potassium can go out through the potassium channel, and the sodium and potassium pump is working. This returns the cell to its normal state. This entire process takes place in milliseconds and helps move the action potential down the neuron. As the action potential goes down the neuron, it reaches the axon terminal. However, this does not mean that the signal is done. It simply means that this neuron must now communicate the signal to another neuron. This communication happens at the synapse. The action potential or electrical signal causes calcium channels to release calcium into the synaptic cleft. This increase in calcium causes proteins to produce and release neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are placed in synaptic vesicles and are carried to the dendrites on a receiving cell. Once they are taken to the receiving cell, they bind to the receptors, and the signal or action potential is passed on to the next neuron. And that's how an action potential moves throughout a neuron.